Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on slavery in colonial America, 1619 to 1750. We want to look at three things in this conversation about this era from the beginning of slavery, when slaves first arrived in America in 1619, to about 1750, which is the time in which we sort of enter the period of revival and revolution, which we're going to talk about in our next conversation. So there are really three major issues that we need to address in the colonial period regarding slavery. The first is to understand the Atlantic slave trade, to understand that colonial Americans decided to participate in the Atlantic slave trade. In other words, how did slaves get from Africa to America? What did that look like? That slave trade occurred beginning in 1526 and went actually beyond when we did it here, well into the 1860s. But we need to understand the Atlantic slave trade. And then secondly, we need to understand the decision to develop what we call immutable slavery or slavery for life, the idea that slaves would be permanent in their status as slaves. And then thirdly, we want to look at the decision to Christianize the slaves. So we want to start with a question, and that is, why Africa? Why did Europeans make the choice to go to Africa to get Black people and bring them to America to enslave them? What was the decision making there? Why Africa? Of all places in the world, why Africa? Henry Louis Gates, uh, very famous historian, um, said this: "The sad truth is that without complex business partnerships between African elites and European traders and commercial agents, the slave trade to the New World would have been impossible, at least on the scale it occurred." To understand the answer to the question, why Africa, we need to take a look at this map of the Atlantic slave trade and understand that somewhere between 10 to 15 million people were moved from Africa to America in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, and even before that, back into the 1500s as well. Why did that occur? As Gates said, there was an economic incentive for the slave trade, for the Atlantic slave trade. And that economic incentive really came from the discovery of America in the 1400s, the late 1400s, and the Europeans understanding that as they discovered America, they discovered an opportunity of a place with vast resources that could provide a tremendous amount of raw material to Europe, which could be made into finished goods and be sold. And so there was an enormous amount of money to be made from this opportunity that existed in America based on the raw materials and natural resources that existed here on these continents. Europeans also had been exploring down the coast of Africa in the 1400s. So at the same time that they had sort of come to an understanding of the economic opportunity that was in America, they also had come to understand what existed in Africa as well. And so, why did they choose Africa as the source of slaves? Well, one reason is simple geography. Africa was close to Europe and it was close to America. And so it was geographically, it had a geographic proximity to the places necessary to be part of this trade. Another reason Africa was chosen was simply because of the availability of slaves there, that slaves could be acquired in Africa. And why was that the case? Well, that was the case because Africans, based on their tribal relationships, had already been enslaving other Africans. This was a practice in Africa that was occurring. And so there was, Europeans knew, an opportunity to get involved in that and to purchase slaves in Africa. And then, thirdly, I think there was the control factor. Because Africans were broken into uh, hundreds and hundreds of different tribal associations, many of which spoke different languages from each other. There was the ability to bring people from Africa and to separate them from their tribes and their relationships and establish greater control over them. So there's a number of reasons for why Africa was the choice. But the overarching thing for us to understand is this economic incentive that existed in North and South America with the discovery of America in the late 1400s. And Europeans are going to respond to that by basically creating a system that moved over several centuries between 10 and 15 million people. Some people have said that it is the most massive movement of forced labor in the history of the world. And obviously, we have to consider the complicated nature of doing something like this, the size of the enterprise that we're talking about, and so we want to look at the different phases of this trade. But before we leave this map, I want to also just highlight that you can see that slaves are going to be brought to South America. And if you look at the numbers here, especially Brazil, probably 5 million of the slaves that are brought to America are brought to Brazil. And you can see one of the reasons for that is it's very close. But another probably 4 to 5 million are brought to the West Indies. Only about 500,000 are brought to what is now the United States of America. So we understand that context of the movement of slaves. And we also want to understand that this was a triangular situation, a triangular trade in which the slaves are purchased in Africa, brought to America, and then those same ships often that brought the slaves to America will be loaded with goods and taken back to Europe. And then in Europe, those goods would be traded and the ships would be loaded with new goods that will be brought to Africa to be traded for slaves. And so that's what the kind of famous historical conversation about the triangular trade would come from. So there are going to be three basic phases of the Atlantic slave trade. The first is the acquisition phase, the phase in which Europeans come to Africa and acquire slaves, and that involved capture. Now, Europeans sometimes would be involved in capture, but more often the capture of slaves was done by other Africans. That could be tribal warfare that could have occurred there, and one tribe could have enslaved another tribe, or it could just be African enslavers going through the interior of Western Africa and capturing people and enslaving them. And then there is secondly the march to the coast, where you would capture the slaves and then you would march them hundreds of miles sometimes to the coast, often chained together, sometimes in wooden like yokes, like oxen are chained together. And ultimately, that horrible march to the coast would culminate by being put in what they called factories. These were fortress-like facilities where slaves were held until they were loaded on ships. And often it was in the factories that the slaves would be separated from their families if they hadn't already been separated, and separated from their tribes. So slaves would not be able to communicate with each other because for purposes of control, so that they couldn't rebel against this process. And so you have this pretty brutal capture march to the coast, and then this holding in factories until the slaves were prepared to be loaded on to the slave ships. And so the second phase is what's called the transportation phase, often referred to as the Middle Passage. This is the phase in which slaves would be loaded on ships for the 2 to 3 month journey to America. It could be longer or shorter depending on what part of America was your ultimate destination. The conditions on these slave ships were awful. Slaves were loaded into the hull of the ships, chained together, given almost piled on top of each other. There was no sanitation facilities. There was human excrement. There's no bathing. Imagine the situation of just raw human survival in the worst possible conditions for months and months as this journey occurred. And we should stop right here and recognize that there were millions of people that died in the acquisition phase. There were probably millions of people that died on these ships. The economic incentive here, though, was so strong that slave ship captains would think in terms of the more people I can get on this ship, the more money I can make. And so there's really the acceptance of a certain number of people are going to die in these various phases of the Atlantic slave trade. And so you have the Middle Passage on the slave ships, or what's called the transportation phase. And then thirdly, you have what's called the arrival phase, and you have whatever port that was the destination, the slave ship would arrive, and the slaves would be taken off of the ship and taken to what's known as the slave auction. And at the slave auction, they would be put in pens where they would be housed, where people that wanted to purchase them would come, very similar to the way we do this with livestock, poke and prod the slaves and look at them to see their value as their labor value, and make a decision as to whether how much that you thought they were worth. And then after this period of the slave pens and being reviewed by people, there would be an auction, and slaves would be literally put up on a block and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Once you were auctioned off, you would be then taken by your new owner to whatever place you would live on a large plantation or small farm. As we've said, this could vary greatly. You could be on a farm, you could be on a plantation with hundreds of slaves, you could be on a small farm with only a few slaves, and then you would enter in what's called the seasoning process. This was a period of time in which you would be trained for the labor that you were purchased to do. You would be taught or conformed to the rules of slavery wherever you were, and who based on whoever owned you, and you would be at the same time taught language skills so that your slave owner, your master, could communicate with you. It is estimated that in America, within the first 3 years of this seasoning process, that maybe as many as a third of all slaves died. So we have the arrival phase, the slave auction and seasoning aspects of that. So this Atlantic slave trade, this massive movement of people, it involved really three major phases: the phase of acquiring the slaves in Africa, the phase of transporting them to America, and the third phase, or the arrival phase. So once we start to think about the investment in the Atlantic slave trade, the effort made to create this really large scale trade industry, this large scale commercial industry that moved millions of people over several centuries. Once these slaves get here to America? And then for our purposes, once they get to North America, once they get to the British colonies, ultimately they're going to develop into the United States of America, what would their status be? What would the long term look like for these people that had been brought here to America for the purpose of exploiting their labor? Ultimately, we know that in America, that became something we call immutable slavery or slavery for life. But why? Why immutable slavery? Why slavery for life? What would be the rationale? Are there other alternatives to the idea of immutable slavery? And in fact, we know that in other parts of America, slavery looked very different than it looked like in North America. In many parts of the Americas, where many more slaves were brought, the life of the slaves was extremely short, and it was looked at as you bring these people here, you work them essentially to death. They die, you bring more people here. And so that's why those numbers are different, in part why those numbers are different. So why in America do we see something like immutable slavery or slavery for life develop, where people have children and there's a new generation of slaves and a natural growth of the slave population? So the development of immutable slavery, immutable just means not changeable. The idea that slavery was something that couldn't be changed, that you were going to be a slave for life, really took about 50 years to develop in the 1600s, about the first 50 years of slave ownership in America. And during that time, there were a lot of different ideas about what was ultimately going to happen with these people that were brought here to be exploited for their labor. Historian Edmund Morgan said some people thought that they would ultimately become potential members of the community, that they would be worked for a period of time. We would get the most labor we could out of them, and then they would be freed and just become like everyone else. And that's kind of an interesting idea. Others thought, well, no, that's not really practical, and it will look different. One of the reasons why this isn't quite an immediate question that everybody has to take a stand on is because people didn't live very long. In colonial Virginia, where most of the early slaves were brought, the the general population didn't live very long, and the slave population, as we saw because of seasoning, didn't live very long. And so when this whole conversation began to shift was when there was increase in life expectancy, both for the general population and the slave population. And as a result of that, we see the development of immutable slavery. We see the writing of slave codes and the sort of institutionalizing of slavery. And so, in this first 50 years, you're going to see a series of laws created that are specific to slaves. And the most important of which is the kind of aspects that mandated slavery for life based on the status of the mother. So one of the things that was going on is you have exploitation of slaves, of slave women by slave owners, and the result is children being born. And so the question is, what's the status of these children? And the slave code said that if your mom is a slave and you're born, you are a slave as well, which protected the exploitation of women that was going on by slave owners. So their children with their own wives wouldn't have the same status as the uh, children they had with their slaves. And so you see this, well, now we're slaves for life. The mom's a slave, she has a child, the child's a slave. And so the slave codes then systematically deprived slaves of their legal rights. They said, you can't move freely from place to place. You're not like other people. You can't legally get married because we're going to separate you potentially and sell you. So we can't have the marriage being an encumbrance to that. You can't protect yourself by carrying a gun. We see a whole separate set of things developed depriving slaves of their legal rights. And then we see kind of the core legal distinction of slaves as chattel or livestock, that they're simply property, and you have basically the same rights that livestock has. And so the slave codes, they etch into legality this idea of immutable or permanent slavery. So we have seen that you have this Atlantic slave trade, you have this movement of millions of people, and the choice in America to in the American colonies to participate was a critical choice. And I think we can't just gloss over the reality that many of the people that were participating in the slave trade in America were people that came to America because they wanted greater freedom. They left Europe because they didn't feel like Europe gave them the freedom they wanted. So they came to America for greater freedom, many of them to escape oppression, and then decided to enslave people and oppress other people to exploit them for their labor. So we see that participation in the slave trade of people in North America, in the British colonies, and then we see the decision to um, make slavery permanent, to make it immutable, to create the slave codes and make a permanent system. And once you make that next decision and you say, all right, these people are not just going to come here and be slaves to us for a few years and die, and they're just going to come here and be slaves for a few years and be free to do something else. They are going to be permanent slaves. That raises another question, which is, what do we do with religion? Because the truth is, the slaves were being brought to a place where most of the people that were enslaving them were identified themselves as Christians. Now, it's important to stop for a second and to recognize that there is a difference between a person who identifies as a Christian and a person that is a Christian. And so we have to separate those two things. But the reality is that the people that enslaved people here in America mostly identified as Christians. In North America, they identified as Protestant Christians. In South America, largely as Catholic Christians, but Christians nonetheless. And so the question is, do we Christianize the slaves? And the choice was made in North America to Christianize the slaves. And why would we do that? I mean, it's something really important to think through. Why Christianize slaves? Why would we do that? And I think that's something that we should take a second and think through. Jemar Tisby said in his book Keller of Compromise, in the mind of Christopher Columbus and others, indigenous people did not have the sophistication to develop their own religious beliefs. Europeans failed to acknowledge the long-standing, well-developed religious beliefs and practices of the people they met. Instead, they viewed indigenous men and women as blank slates on which Christian missionaries could write the gospel. So when we think about converting the slaves to Christianity, Tisby gives us a very, very important basic element to that, and that is the idea of what we're going to call blank slate paternalism. This is the idea that these indigenous people in Africa, these Africans, don't have any kind of religious idea of their own. They're a blank slate. And because of that, we can write on that slate our own religion. That's the paternalism aspect. They're like children that don't have any other knowledge. So we're going to be like the parents, and we're going to write on this blank slate our faith, our Christianity. And a historian named Rebecca Ann Getz kind of elaborates on this in a book called The Baptism of Early Modern Virginia. And she says that people believed back in this time of this idea of hereditary heathenism, the idea that parents don't just pass on their physical characteristics to their children, but they also pass on religion. And so you have generations of Africans who have inherited from their parents heathenism, this lack of any kind of religious belief structure. And so the question is, well, can you convert people like this? Can you convert heathens? And the answer to that question is yes, and it's yes because of what's called monogenesis theory. Mono simply means one, Genesis means beginning. And according to Getz, this idea of monogenesis theory said that everybody descended from one person, from Adam, all people. And as a result of that, all people can receive Christianity. So blank slate paternalism is possible. This writing on the blank slate of heathens, this our Christian faith is possible because all people descended from Adam and are capable of receiving Christianity. That's the thinking of this period that helps us to understand. So then, once we began to convert the slaves, and people then started to come to these areas where slaves lived and convert them, the next question is, are we going to baptize them? And that's important because baptism is in itself a sort of it's sort of like your license to be part. It's sort of like your admissions card or your ticket to become part of the organization. So are we going to baptize slaves? Are we going to like formally recognize that they are Christians? And the question that's raised right away is, does that make them free? Does that make them free people? The Virginia General Assembly actually in 1667 wrote a law and said, no, it doesn't make them free. It said, it is enacted and declared by this grand assembly and the authority thereof that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. And so right away we had to establish that baptism does not make you free. And so Francis Lejeune, an Anglican missionary who was very involved in converting and baptizing slaves and also Native Americans, developed what's called his baptism pledge of loyalty. And so when a slave got baptized, they took this pledge before they were baptized as a Christian. And the pledge was, you desire in the presence of God and before this congregation that you do not ask for holy baptism out of any design to free yourself from the duty and obedience you owe to your master while you live, but merely for the good of your soul and to partake of the grace and blessings promised to the members of the Church of Jesus Christ. So slaves would take this pledge and say, no, I'm not, I'm just looking to free my soul, not to become free from being a slave. So you can see in the baptism loyalty pledge the really essence of the Christian message to the slaves. What did the message look like? And it really had two main aspects. The message was, you are becoming a Christian, you are receiving spiritual deliverance, not physical deliverance. Your soul is being delivered. There's a better world coming for you. You have a relationship with God that has determined your spiritual future. You have a relationship with Him now. You have a relationship with Him in the future when you die in heaven. But you are not seeing any change in your physical situation. You're not being delivered from being a slave. It has nothing to do with freedom or deliverance from slavery. And then the second aspect of the message was the idea of, we can use the Bible, we can use Christianity to impress on the slave's mind the importance of duty, obedience, and loyalty. All things which the Bible does actually teach. It teaches it's important for us to do our duties. It teaches obedience to earthly authority and heavenly authority. It teaches loyalty. And so they're going to craft a message that says you are spiritually, not physically delivered, and here on earth you are responsible as a Christian to do your duty, to be obedient, and to be loyal. So the Christianization of slaves involved conversion, which was legitimized through the concept of blank slate paternalism, this idea that slaves had inherited heathenism and therefore were blank slates. They didn't have any religious views. And paternalism said, we can just teach them what we believe and there's nothing else there. And so that kind of justified the idea of converting the slaves. And then baptism, the issue of freedom was addressed with the baptism pledge of loyalty. And really, the core message, kind of wrapped up in all of this, is the idea that you are being spiritually delivered from your sins, but you are not being physically delivered. And in this world, Christianity teaches us to be dutiful and obedient of whatever situation that we find ourselves in. So in this conversation on slavery in colonial America, we have looked at the Atlantic slave trade. How did slaves get here? And we have looked at the parts of that trade, the brutality of it, the massiveness of it, the economic incentive of being able to make enormous amounts of money, Europeans essentially choosing to come to Africa and to acquire slaves, to transport slaves, and then to, in the arrival phase in America, season them, auction them off, and then season them into their work. And we have seen how literally millions of people died in this brutal, this physically and psychologically brutal and dehumanizing system of the Atlantic slave trade. Secondly, we looked at the decision in colonial America to make slavery immutable, to decide that the slaves that were being brought here are slaves for life, to create slave codes, to define slave status as based on the mother status, and to mandate slavery for life, and to create a system around that. And then lastly, we looked at the decision to Christianize the slaves, the idea of blank slate paternalism, that these people have a blank slate and they don't have any religion, and so we can teach them Christianity. We're going to baptize them, but we're going to make clear that that doesn't free them. And we're going to teach them this message that says you're being spiritually delivered, not physically delivered. And now you are, as a Christian, bound to be dutiful, and to be obedient and loyal to those that are in charge of you, to your earthly masters. So slavery in colonial America, really dealing with three very large and important things that kind of laid the foundation for slavery in the rest of our American history context going forward. Some questions to consider based on our conversation. How does Scripture explain something like the Atlantic slave trade? What does the Bible say about these kinds of things, about something as massive and inhumane as the Atlantic slave trade? What can we find as an explanation for this in the Bible? Secondly, was permanent slavery more Christian than temporary slavery? Was the decision to make slavery permanent? Can you make the argument that it actually was more Christian to do that than temporary slavery? Why or why not? And then thirdly, was it wrong to Christianize the slaves? Is there any legitimacy to the decision to Christianize the slaves? Why or why not? Thank you for joining this conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.